Hargilla is feeding on a reptile, how Hargilla is feeding on a fish, and how every species is important and how we are also part of it. I think they are our future guardian of storks and future guardian of biodiversity. We always think that conservation is only happening in protected areas, national parks. But in villages, we have our biodiversity and we have to protect them. If we are optimistic and if we are consistent, what we do, we can achieve what we want. Nobody can stop us. We are very unstoppable.
Thanks for watching this episode. If you'd like to dive deeper into this story or learn how you can help protect biodiversity near you, visit wildhope.tv and come back on Mondays for more.
Okay. Oh, thought it was 11:11. Stream? Okay.
Humans have been the cause of many extinctions throughout the long, bloody history of our species. One of the animals that owe their destruction to our activities is the aurochs, the wild ancestors of modern-day domesticated cattle, which disappeared when the last individual died in a forest in Poland in 1627. Aurochs were remarkable animals. Standing as tall as 1.8 meters at the shoulder in some cases, they were incredibly fierce beasts, and impressed even Julius Caesar himself when he mentioned them in commentaries on the Gallic War. Their strength and speed are extraordinary, he wrote. They spare neither man nor wild beast which they have espied. But since the domesticated descendants of the wild aurochs are still alive today, in a way they didn't truly go extinct. Of course, most cattle breeds around today are not all that much like their ancestors, but that hasn't stopped humans from attempting to reverse the actions of the past and resurrect the aurochs. This is the story of the first attempt to bring these animals back, but be warned, it's a pretty sinister tale intertwined with one of the darkest periods of human history. First, let's introduce the main players. Lutz Heck was born in Berlin in 1892 and his brother Heinz in 1894. The brothers were the sons of Ludwig Heck, director of the Berlin Zoo at the time, and both grew up in the grounds of the zoo where they were surrounded by animals, as a result becoming very interested in zoology early on in their lives. In 1928, Heinz Heck became director of Hellerbrunn Zoo in Munich, while Lutz, in 1932, succeeded their father as director of Berlin Zoo. The brothers had both become interested in the aurochs by this point, and both believed that they could breed back the wild ancestor by carefully selecting the modern cattle that most closely resembled their view of what aurochs looked like and breeding them with each other to highlight and recreate the form. The brothers studied depictions of the aurochs in cave art, woodcuts and literature and looked at the remaining skulls and other bones to determine what an aurochs would have looked like alive, and then both of them set about independently trying to backbreed various types of cattle in order to recreate the appearance of their coat coloration, horn shape and markings. Heinz used a variety of European breeds, including Highland cattle, Corsican cattle, brown Swiss and others, while Lutz used some of these breeds as well as different ones such as French and Spanish fighting bulls, which Heinz did not include. By the mid-1930s, both brothers reported success, producing some of the first animals that would come to be known as Heck cattle. However, world events were taking a dark turn and the lives of Heinz and Lutz were about to go very different ways. Despite their similar interests and upbringings, the Heck brothers had contrasting opinions on the Nazis who were growing in power at the time. Heinz had been married to a Jewish woman and was suspected of being a communist, and as a result was one of the first people to be imprisoned at Dachau in the early 30s. He was eventually released, but remained conflicted about the Nazi regime, though he would eventually join the Ahnenerbe and become part of Nazi research programs. His brother Lutz, on the other hand, fully embraced the Nazi party, joining in 1937 and becoming good friends with Hermann Göring. Göring was greatly interested in the project to resurrect the Aurochs, as he shared with Lutz a passion for hunting and fantasized about recreating the tales in the German epic poem Nibelungenlied, in which Teutonic heroes go about killing elk, European bison or Wiesent, and Aurochs in the old forests of Europe. A couple of the many titles that Göring held were Reich Huntmaster and Reich Forestmaster, and he considered the restoration of the ecosystems present at the time of the tales recounted in the poem a significant objective to achieve, as a sort of way to return to a mythic and supposedly pure past. The malevolent motivations of the Nazi regime enabled Lutz Heck to continue his backbreeding projects, and eventually to introduce some of his alleged aurochs into forests in Poland, where he and Göring would reportedly wear traditional dress and carry spears in order to hunt the animals inhabiting the forests that had now been made into hunting reserves. The creatures Lutz had created were very aggressive animals, and after observing their violent habits, he announced that the extinct aurochs has arisen again as German wild species in the Third Reich. But were they really aurochs? That's something we'll come back to in a bit.
No.
Lutz was also later tasked with breeding the Weisent back from the edge of extinction in a conservation area that Göring opened north of Berlin, so that they could also be used for reintroduction to other forests. However, the cattle breed created by Lutz did not make it past the end of the Second World War, with many being killed during Allied bombing raids on Berlin. A few were reported to have survived for a while in certain Polish forests, but these too soon died out. The cattle created by Heinz Heck, though, did actually survive in Munich, and so all the Heck cattle around today originate from this brother's breeding experiments instead. But the Heck cattle are a particularly controversial breed, and not only for the obvious reason of their Nazi origins. Many people have heavily criticized the backbreeding methods used by the brothers, and maintain that the resultant Heck cattle don't resemble the wild aurochs at all. First of all, the Heck cattle aren't as physically large as we know aurochs were. Whereas the true ancestral wild cattle could stand as tall as 1.8 meters, Heck bulls only average about 1.4 meters tall and the cows only 1.3 meters. There are actually many other breeds of cattle in which the bulls are larger than those of the Heck cattle and therefore closer to the true size of an aurochs. Additionally, the overall body shape is very different to what we understand of aurochs, with the Heck cattle being much bulkier, having shorter legs, smaller heads, and lacking the impressive shoulder musculature of their wild ancestors, among other details such as the horn shape, which doesn't appear much like the shape the brothers were aiming for. The coat coloration of some Heck cattle does appear to be similar to that of the aurochs, however there is a significant deal of variation within the breed. The aurochs coloration is well known from the records we have left of the animals. The females were all reddish-brown in colour, whereas the bulls developed a much darker blackish-brown coat that had a light stripe along the top of the back. Some Heck cattle today do indeed have these colorations, but there are also many that have altered colours and so don't look like aurochs. The methods that the brothers used to breed these cattle appear to have been deeply flawed, with an inaccurate view of what aurochs really looked like and their desire to create the breed as quickly as possible, leading to a great deal of carelessness and oversimplification with their experiments. As a result, the Heck cattle breed really cannot be said to be resurrected aurochs. They're simply a breed that possesses some of the characteristics known to have been present in their wild ancestors. However, today there are actually several ongoing projects that aim to bring back the aurochs, or an aurochs-like cattle at least. The oldest of these, started in 1996, is the Taurus project run by a conservation group in Germany, which is attempting to improve upon Heck cattle by crossbreeding them further with other types of cattle in order to promote the more aurochs-like features, creating a breed known as the Taurus cattle. Then there's also the Tauros program that began in 2007 and is run by a Dutch foundation which is avoiding the use of Heck cattle, instead looking for the genetically closest living breeds to aurochs. This project has become a huge collaboration between several different organizations
that makes more
in
sense.
multiple European countries, and it's thought that by as soon as 2025 the first truly aurochs-like animals could be produced by this program. There are also other projects looking to recreate some form of aurochs-like modern cattle, including the Urus project, which hopes to utilize genome editing, as well as the Auerrind project, which is avoiding heck cattle and attempting to breed a more docile version of the aurochs. Today, the aurochs breeding projects are used not to further heinous political conquests, but instead for actual scientific and conservation purposes. It's thought that by rewilding areas of Europe through the reintroduction of cattle that fill the same ecological role as aurochs did, a healthier ecosystem that supports greater biodiversity can be maintained. With herds of aurochs-like cattle grazing, more open habitats can be preserved just like they were in the past when aurochs were a keystone species of Europe. While the heck cattle may have been a failed attempt tainted by association with Nazism, these modern projects are much more promising and offer some hope that we may once again witness something close to an aurochs. It'll be interesting to see how successful the programs are in recreating aurochs-like animals, and hopefully such beasts will have some very positive impact.
What? What the fuck?
Camels are one of the most unorthodox builds in the game. In the right conditions, their combination of unique abilities and special set of elemental resistances makes for a shockingly effective strategy. But overall, where do camels rank on the tier list? Is their weird shape and odd skill set actually overpowered, or is their current player base carried by their human allies? Today we'll discuss the history, stats, and abilities of the camel, and ultimately decide. We'll begin with the origin of the camel. Camels first began rising in the meta at a time when a lot of mammalian herbivore builds were really taking off. Some of these herbivores spec'd into an ability called rumination to gain bonus XP from the newly buffed grass spawn rates. Some herbivores spec'd into more powerful PvP abilities, like keratinized horns and armor, in order to remain more well defended when out in the open. The camel, by contrast, took neither of these paths. Because they could not digest grass, they instead needed to spec into abilities which would allow them to survive the frequent long treks between an ever-decreasing supply of nutritious tree leaves. So what are the camel's most important abilities? The most obvious one is their hump. The hump serves multiple purposes. Primarily, it's used as a site for fat storage, functioning as an energy reserve which allows camels to survive incredibly long journeys without access to food. With a maxed out fat reserve, camel players can ignore hunger damage for several months as they search for new spots to forage. But in addition to providing starvation resistance, allocating all the camel's body fat to one spot gives them excellent heat resistance by allowing for extremely efficient heat exchange everywhere else on the surface of the camel's body. Now, of course, this ability does come at a cost. The hump is an awkward and cumbersome load to bear, weighing the camel down and making its movement a lot more wobbly and top-heavy while running. Definitely not an ability you could just throw onto any other herbivore build and see benefit from. You need to have other abilities to help mitigate the weaknesses the hump incurs. So what other abilities does the camel have? The second main ability is the camel's feet pads. Rather than walking on hooved toes like most other herbivores, camels spec into large padded feet. Now, normally when a player spends their evolution points unlocking padded feet, they're doing so in order to mask the sound of their steps and buff their stealth stat. While it does technically offer a small stealth bonus, something as tall as a camel is not going to be very successful at hiding. Instead, similar to the hump, this ability protects camels from the stress and chip damage most players would accrue when walking for such long distances. It also spreads out their weight, preventing them from sinking into whatever surface they're standing on. This is especially important when traversing sandy or snowy environments, as it negates the movement penalties from this sort of terrain. Camels have a few other minor abilities as well. Their sickle-shaped blood cells make them more resistant to dehydration, and their tough, leathery mouth negates puncture damage, allowing the camel to be one of the few builds able to eat cacti without being hurt by their spines. A lot of players are under the impression that camels possess a powerful spitting ranged attack, similar to the cobra or archerfish. Unfortunately, no, there's not really anything particularly threatening about the camel's spit, nor do they actually employ this skill in combat. They may vomit when threatened, but this is usually just a result of stress, not a defensive ability. That's not to say the camel's mouth isn't dangerous though. In addition to their tough leathery
They can
palate,
bite.
one of the things that sets camels apart from other herbivores is that their teeth can actually deal serious damage. And with a neck as long, powerful, and flexible as the camel's, there's not many angles you could attack a camel from without risking a nasty bite counterattack. Camels can also attack with their kicks, although their padded feet won't deal as much damage as, say, the sharp hooves of a zebra or giraffe. Anyway, those are the main abilities of the camel build. Next, let's look at the camel's stats. And quick note, I should mention that there are two variations of camel, the dromedary and Bactrian. Their most apparent difference is that the dromedary has
One's
one
furry.
eye, while the Bactrian has two. But honestly, the more important difference is in their base stats. Bactrians are larger, more powerful, and better adapted to the cold. The dromedary is smaller, but slightly more agile, and better suited for extreme heat. Camels have slightly above average intelligence, necessary for them to be able to remember the long routes that they travel on. As mentioned earlier, camels do have a more damaging bite than most herbivores, but compared to the damage large herbivores can dish out using their tusks or horns, they still fall short. Their defenses are quite strong, especially when it comes to elemental resistances. But on top of those, the camel's height makes it very difficult for predators to land an attack on them. Thanks to their special terrain movement bonuses, most of the time they don't even need to worry about predators, as no sane player would seriously try to follow them into an inhospitable desert. But even on normal solid ground, the camel's movement speed is pretty decent, albeit kind of awkward. Obviously, even with their padded feet slightly dampening the sound of their steps, their stealth is still abysmal, given that camels are the third tallest land animal after the giraffe and elephant. And lastly, their perception is pretty normal for a mammal, except for the camel's partial immunity to the blindness condition, on account of their long eyelashes, which block incoming sand and dust. This is all well and good, but the question remains, just how viable is this setup really? Is the camel just another build completely carried by humanity? So the camel is actually one of the more recent additions to the humans' party, with domestication being unlocked during the mid to late Bronze Age, well after dogs, cats, and horses had already formed alliances with humanity. And it was with the last one, horses, that camels were competing with for the spot on the team, as both horses and camels are useful to function as a mount. Horses are the faster mount, and in a lot of scenarios, that's truly all that matters. In Bronze Age human versus human PvP, being able to outmaneuver and flank their enemies was one of the most important factors in securing victory. But for just about everything else, camels were far more reliable. Camels have a higher equipment load, meaning they can carry much more cargo. They have higher vitality and defense, and thus can carry human players a much further distance in much worse conditions. And of course, the fact that they are not impeded by difficult terrain is a huge perk for choosing the camel. It's for this reason that as humanity began transitioning away from a nomadic raiding playstyle and towards Bronze Age palace-based economies, having a mount that could carry goods across the vast
This is
desert
fine.
empires was of vital importance. Camels were the only viable option for humans to cross the large deserts, like the Outback, Sahara, and Mojave, until humanity unlocked trains on the tech tree. So for a substantial length of time, camels were an integral part of the economy across most of the world. And although railroads have made them obsolete in some servers, when it comes to crossing the desert, they are still genuinely one of the best options. Similar to horses and cattle, the vast majority of camel players are purely opting for the human-focused team combo playstyle. There are only around 1,000 players who are part of the truly wild faction that never joined up with humans. Does this mean without humans, camels would be low-tier trash? I can see why you might jump to that conclusion. Despite their immense physical strength, I rated domestic cattle as B-tier, in part because without humanity, it's unclear if they could even survive in the wilderness. Honestly, B-tier might have even been too generous. But there's no question, when left to fend for themselves in the wilderness, camels not only survive, they thrive. When humanity unlocked the motorized transport,
In Australia, right?
human players kicked out the camel players from their party. This happened in America, in the Middle East, and most significantly in Australia. Now, an invasive mammal succeeding in Australia is really not that big a surprise, but thriving in the outback specifically is undoubtedly impressive. Here, they must contend with one of the other most successful Australian invaders, the dingo. And let's be real, it's not even close to being an even matchup. Being historically from Asia, camels had to contend with everything from lions and leopards to wolves and even tigers. So despite their awkward top-heavy appearance and lack of powerful damage-dealing abilities, Their incredible survival skill earns them the rank of
Oaxaca,
ages.
Oaxaca,
Now, this
6-9
video
Oscar
focuses
en
specifically on
final.
the Bactrian and Dromedary camel, the two builds most players would associate with the word camel. But the camel faction does technically contain two other builds, the llama and alpaca. These belong to the player base of prehistoric camels, which chose to venture south into the South America server, rather than across the Bering Strait and into Asia. Because of their vastly different environments, they obviously spec into different abilities. However, a lot of their core features are more or less the same. I have a lot to say about these creatures. Mostly that they are the most disgusting, nasty creatures I've ever encountered. Alright, so this ad read is going to take a bit of a different turn than usual, but here's the deal. A few months ago, I got a message from the team at Wendover Productions asking if I wanted to be on a game show. Considering this is the same team that makes the show Jetlag the Game, I immediately said yes. And as a
Jetlag
result
the
of this
Game.
decision, I ended up being on a wild, crazy show that ultimately led to me getting kicked and spat on by alpacas. That's really all you need to know, but let me explain a little more about the concept behind this show. It's a game show where a bunch of YouTubers, including myself, had to compete in a series of challenges in order to win money. The trick is that one of us was a saboteur, a traitor who would deliberately but subtly throw challenges. And at the end of each day, we need to vote off one player that we thought was the traitor. The twist though is that all of us were the traitor. It's an immensely fun show that I'm incredibly proud to have been a part of. It's called The Getaway, and it's an original series streaming now only on Nebula. Nebula is a streaming service owned and operated by creators like me. Many of you have heard me talk about Nebula before. It's the creator-owned platform with no ads, no algorithm, no clickbait, and phenomenal content. In addition to The Getaway, Nebula is home to a huge library of amazing originals, including some of my own. I also upload all of my videos to Nebula first, so if you want early access to all of my videos and tons of great original content, you'll love it. If this all sounds good to you, you can sign up to Nebula using my link at nebula.tv/tiersu, or use the link below, which supports me directly and gets you access to all this amazing content for 40% off their annual plans, as little as around $2.50 a month. Thank you all so much for watching, and thanks again to Nebula for sponsoring this video. Birds are one of the most popular playable classes in the game, with a huge number of successful builds and tons of cool strategies. However, some of these strategies have clearly been more successful than others. So today we'll be going over the bird tier list to see which bird ranks highest. But before we get into looking at specific bird builds, let's do an overview of the basic attributes and special abilities the bird faction has access to, as well as a quick rundown of the history of the bird faction. So birds are one of the newer factions in the game, joining the game's roster during the latter part of the Mesozoic expansion. They began as an offshoot of the dinosaur faction that was specifically adapted to arboreal gameplay, but when the devs dropped the Cenozoic balance patch, these small avians were the only dinosaurs not to be hit by the banhammer. Fast forward to today's meta, and birds are one of the most successful factions in the game, owing this success to a handful of powerful, unique abilities, in addition to the obvious flying attribute. First of which is their beak. Now, beaks were not an entirely new ability for the reptile player base, but birds went far deeper into the beak skill tree than most dinosaurs ever had, with many bird players opting for extremely specialized beaks to give them an edge in specific scenarios. However, even the basic beak offers plenty of advantages. While their lack of teeth does mean that they deal reduced damage with their bite attack, birds can be far more accurate with their pecking attacks, enabling them to hit weak points or secure grabs on smaller targets, such as the thin hurt box of a snake. Beaks also offer moderate protection, potentially reducing headshot damage and nullifying imprecise counterattacks. Beaks also offer some of the best stab-type damage in the game, which, when used accurately, deal massive damage on crit. Beaks are also excellent tools for dealing with parasites. In fact, they're so good that oftentimes, other less dexterous players will party up with bird support players in order to have a better matchup against parasites. Feathers are also a unique and powerful tool exclusive to birds that provides excellent full protection without causing the user to become too over-encumbered to fly. Feathers also offer pretty substantial defense against crush-type attacks, which is especially important to birds because of their hollow bones trait. Hollow bones are another ability meant to synergize with the flying playstyle. Now, a common misconception is that bird bones are hollow in order to reduce equipment load, but actually they're hollow in order to let bird players fill them with air, which grants them a massive boost to their maximum stamina. Without this, it'd be extremely tough for a bird to fly for any significant period of time. The trade-off, of course, is that a broken bone not only deals serious damage, but also potentially reduces the player's maximum stamina by a huge margin. So a bird player will need all of the blunt damage defense it can get. And speaking of blunt damage, the bird's lower bone density means the bird's own blunt force strikes, like wing attacks, also deal reduced damage. The top-tier bird builds are the ones that can best capitalize on the strengths of their class while mitigating potential weaknesses. That about covers the basics, so let's get into the tier list. At the bottom of the tier list, we have two flightless bird builds, both with essentially the same glaring weakness. These are the kiwi and kakapo. Kiwis are hilariously part of the same faction as ostriches, emus, and cassowaries. For some reason, they opted to give up the flight ability, but didn't use the extra available skill points to spec into gigantism like the rest of their squad did. The result is a build that can literally only exist on island servers where there is no active
That's
mammal player
insane.
base, aka New Zealand.
Hey, yo.
The kakapo is a flightless
Yo, man, I'm
version of
happy.
the parrot, and although parrots are
Uh-oh. Depends. I saw news about a huge strike on IDF soldiers. Tell me. What is it? I have not. Haven't really looked at the news today. Only just saw on my feed for Instagram that IOF soldiers got hit. Also, by the way, hello.
undoubtedly excellent bird builds, the
Hope you're doing
flightless
fine.
weakness is too glaring to ignore. Due to invasive species like rats and cats establishing a presence on island servers, both of these flightless bird builds are seeing major declines in their player base, and I would not be surprised if they all ended up switching mains. Flight is just too strong an ability to pass up, which brings me to the next builds on my tier list. So I see what these builds were going for. Being giant could potentially make up for the lack of flight, but in practice this didn't quite pan out. While these are technically the strongest birds in terms of base power and defensive stats, for their weight class they are woefully underpowered. They're one of the few megafauna builds that can be taken down by cheetahs, when they should be able to completely annihilate cheetahs with their powerful claws. Their huge weak point presents a lot of opportunity for counterattack too, so if they
This? Oh yeah. Haifa. Yeah, at least 50 ambulances. Yeah. I made a post about it actually. And actually, yeah, thank you for fucking bringing that up. I'm old enough to remember when the dining halls started getting hit in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that changed a lot of people's... They changed a lot of people's minds.
bold, they're setting themselves up for a tough loss. Lastly, the fact that they are forced to nest on the ground forces them into an even more vulnerable position than most birds, as ratite eggs are extremely valuable as loot. Objective defense is not an easy task even for
Oaxaca,
so for
Oaxaca, 6-9 Mike Oscar, en final, pista 3-3.
Next on the tier list we have the hummingbird.
Corrección,
Spec purely into mobility.
pista 02, 6-9 Mike Oscar,
Is the only bird built
Oaxaca,
with
Oaxaca.
full 360-degree movement, similar to a dragonfly. This, combined with its
Yeah,
extremely
they hit the
small
dining
size,
hall.
enables the hummingbird to very quickly change direction mid-flight, allowing it to easily dodge attacks and fly around obstacles. More importantly, it allows the hummingbird to access nectar, which is an extremely valuable source of energy that's normally inaccessible to birds, since birds are usually too heavy to land on flowers, and not agile enough to access nectar mid-flight. This all sounds great.
I
but
love
the
hummingbirds.